We're talking to Dr. Baldwin in the Department of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University, and the topic is Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, before we had our first commercial break, we were talking about some of the formative influences on the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. But now let's move a little beyond that and talk about scholarship dealing with Dr. Martin Luther King. Certainly quite a bit has been written about Dr. King, his assassination, etc. But now, I think as we indicated earlier, you are among the most published of Martin Luther King scholars. And let's see if we can have you to give us some information relative to your publications dealing with Dr. King, and to say perhaps something else about some of the other publications later on.
Yes, I've been writing about Dr. King since about 1984. I did a lot of research on his life in the early 1980s, and I published my first article on his cultural roots in 1984. Since that time, I have published, I guess, about 25 articles in newspapers, journals, magazines concerning Dr. King. And I have 3 books on Dr. King. I published my first book on Dr. King in 1990. And the book is called There Is a Balm in Gilead. The subtitle, The Cultural Roots of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And in that particular book, I explored the importance of these formative influences that we were talking about earlier. I looked at the role of the church in his development. I looked at the role of the extended family. I talked about his exposure to Southern culture. I talked about his experiences growing up in a segregated area of the South. I also talked about his tremendous sense of place and his sense of regional responsibility. He always had that idea that I must come back to the South after I'm well educated and contribute some of what I've gotten through the educational process to transforming the South. That, of course, is the topic of my first book, and There Is a Balm in Gilead. I also looked at his vision for the South. So if I had to use one word to describe the first book, it would be roots. In 1992, I published a second volume called To Make the Wounded Whole, The Cultural Legacy of Martin Luther King, Jr. And in that particular book, I moved beyond a discussion of his roots to look at his legacy in terms of ideals, his legacy in terms of activism, and I explored particularly his concept of community, or his communitarian ideal. His idea that we should work to create a society in which people realize their essential oneness under God, where people realize their need to work together towards certain common goals, irrespective of race, class, gender, nationality, so forth. So that second book sort of picks up where the first book left off. And in that second book, I moved from South to nation to world. I talked about how Dr. King, for an example, started out as a Southern black Baptist preacher in a small town, Montgomery, Alabama, and how he moved from that point to become a national leader and ultimately a world leader and a world symbol. And that's what the second book is all about.
What was that marvelous transformation from the local Baptist preacher to the world leader, as you indicated, for Dr. King?
Well, that is, I think, a progression in his life that few scholars have actually taken seriously. Most scholars tend to view Dr. King as a Southern black leader who led movements, civil rights campaigns in the South. Some scholars speak of him as a national symbol, a national leader. But very few have actually treated him as a world symbol and a world leader, as one who has had a great influence over the years on movements abroad, movements for liberation abroad. But what I've tried to show is that Dr. King embodied a certain kind of progression in his own life. That he began, of course, with the particularity of his own experience. That is, a black preacher in the South, working among people whom he knew well, Southern blacks, trying to bring about some equality, some justice, some equality of opportunity in the South. But in time, he became a national figure. mainly because he decided that the movement could not remain essentially a Southern movement, that it had to become a national movement to address the problems of racial discrimination, economic injustice on a national level. So certainly by 1963, after the March on Washington, Dr. King had become a national figure because at the March on Washington, if you recall, he made it clear that he and others in the movement had to dramatize the problems of poverty and economic injustice and racism at the national level. By 1965, as he spoke out against U.S. involvement in Vietnam, as he dealt with the issues of colonialism in Africa, apartheid in South Africa, poverty and economic injustice in various parts of the Third World, from 1965 up until his death in 1968, he certainly emerged as a national figure. And what I've tried to do, of course, in my works, of course, is to show this progression in his life, how he embodied this in his own life. The very last book I published in 1995, called Toward the Beloved Community, Martin Luther King Jr. in South Africa, actually is the first book that deals with Dr. King's international influence. We've had a number of articles to treat him in an international context, but this is the first book to really look at his impact on movements abroad. And what I've tried to do in that book is to show that from the 1950s up until his death in 1968, he had a great impact on what was going on in South Africa. He provided a lot of moral support. He provided financial support. He even corresponded with South African anti-apartheid activists. They learned from his writings and so forth. But his influence in South Africa extended beyond his death, because in the 1970s there were a lot of debate with Alan Bosak and Desmond Tutu and other South Africans about the relevance of Dr. King's ideals and Mohandas K. Gandhi's ideals to the South African context. So I dealt with his influence in South Africa in the 1970s, his influence through the 1980s when there was a lot of debate in South Africa about the proper means to eliminate apartheid, violence, nonviolence. Dr. King was at the center of that particular discussion. And I've dealt also with his continuing impact on South Africa. And I conclude with some focus on the relevance and implications of his communitarian ideal for the future of South Africa.
Very good. And Dr. Baldwin, we're ready for our second commercial break, after which we'll come back and talk about the assassination. And we'll be back with you following this commercial break.